We've had as many misses as we've had hits, and that's no secret. America's culinary history is full of train wrecks we're glad to have left behind, and if you're ever curious about how deep that wormhole goes, well, that's exactly what I'm here for. Tune in as we go through some Sunday suppers we're so glad we moved on from. A boiled calf's head used to be an American and European staple, and this was largely true for a big chunk of recent history. Particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was very common for people to rely on organ meat for their daily nutrition. In fact, with this recipe, people didn't use bits and pieces of the head, but instead, the entire head, brain, tongue, and all other parts attached would be boiled until it was tenderized to the right level of softness. Then it would be served whole with a caper sauce or some kind of savory gravy. There were enough reasons why something like this was popular, mostly the fact that industrialized meat processing hadn't gotten everywhere and it was still in its baby stages, and refrigeration was just a far-off concept. What I can't understand is why some people actually thought this was a sign of luxury or wealth. Back then, it was the era of nose-to-tail cooking, but lately, it's simply become far more rare to see a restaurant sticking to that and surviving. Nose-to-tail cooking, especially when the head is still intact, just isn't as appealing as your local Subway anymore, and that's just the cold hard facts of the situation. The jellied chicken loaf was a dish that was made from shredded cooked chicken and homemade gelatin that was made via stock or Knox gelatin packets. You had bare-bones seasonings and some vegetables like cabbages or hard-boiled eggs in the loaf, and it would be served cold as an appetizer for Sunday supper. One of the reasons people would make this dish for Sunday is because it could be made in advance and it was okay to serve it cold, which really cut the work for a lot of home chefs. Plus, this recipe involved cheap cuts of meat, and it was very economical for a lot of people. In the middle of the 20th century, there was also a rise of gelatin-based aspic dishes, but lately all that's gone in the opposite direction. Most people enjoy Jell-O in purely dessert forms now or as a quick snack. There's also just a general distaste for the texture, and for the amount of effort it takes, a lot of people think the idea of a cold jelly meat dish doesn't offer enough bang for your buck. Stuffed beef heart actually is as weird as it sounds. An entire beef heart had to be cleaned and stuffed before the dish was a meal, and while this might sound like some rich person's hobby, just collecting beef hearts to cook, it was actually a frugal meal. The heart was a very tough organ. It was covered by hard muscle and tissue that just made it very undesirable for customers and butchers alike. Most shops would discard it or sell it at a fraction of the price they were selling other things. Hence why a lot of people took to this, not out of a craving for beef heart, but just so they could stretch their paycheck a little longer. Again, nose-to-tail eating did decline, but even then, this is just as extreme as a calf's head. Why do we have to eat either the head or the heart? You tell me. Either way, I'm glad that this is out of style because I genuinely cannot imagine what I would do if I visited someone's palace and they served me a heart stuffed with cabbage, lettuce, and onions. That's scary. Spam and lima bean casserole is every bit the atrocity it sounds, and it's one of the worst things we've ever done as a country with spam. A salty and processed pork product that was supposed to make life a lot more convenient for everyone wasn't supposed to be used like this, and I'm glad we can agree with that. Mostly. The middle of the 20th century was a scary time because it was wrought with economic strife. Your neighbor could genuinely ruin your entire week with one of these, especially because this was supposed to be a budget-friendly meal for families. Lima beans, cream sauce, and breadcrumbs or cheese. Who could possibly think that was a good idea? Spam just used to be so available that people were making anything. And the middle of the 20th century was also a time when casseroles were slowly reviving and fusion food was slowly beginning to take off too. But this isn't the direction you go in, and I'm glad people left this in the last century. It's still not as bad as the next one, though. No, very few things on this list are as bad as this one. Liver and banana casserole was definitely an event in American history. You would combine sliced liver with bananas that had been baked in either a creamy sauce or a really savory one, and then some versions even added cheese on top of it. What people would do to convince themselves that this was tolerable was remind themselves of the fact that the liver is a superfood. You can kind of eat healthy if you treat it like any other chore, right? You get lots of good things for time spent doing something you absolutely hate. Typical job experience, right? Not even that kind of practical rationale could help this dish. A lot of people immediately realized this was an absolute catastrophe that should not ever see the light of day. Fair play to them, not every experiment is going to give you lasagna or salmagundi. But this couldn't have possibly come at a worse time. The liver was already in the public eye for its metallic taste and how bold of a flavor it had. But this was just pushing more and more supporters away from the liver fandom. Then again, if that's the price we had to pay to make sure this thing stays dead, then so be it. Sardine whips were a dish that had the texture of a mousse but the taste of canned sardines. Whipped cream, gelatin, and cream cheese can work wonders in terms of texture. But when you throw something like sardines in there, you just ruin the whole thing. The mixture was also whipped to the moon and back until it was as light as a cloud. So, in terms of preparation, I think people did whatever they could to make this appetizing. Unfortunately, nothing can mask the stage-stealing taste of sardines, and I do not use that term in a good way. The fishy taste was way too overpowering for a lot of people, especially Americans who had grown up in the South or in places that did not have any fishing or seafood culture. What seafood people did like was typically grilled, roasted, or just fried. Gelatin-heavy party foods were also falling out of fashion, and those were just too many nails for this recipe's coffin. If you boiled cabbage in milk, you either were pretty bad at judging what a dish would end up tasting like, or you just had a fondness for experimenting. Cabbage and milk stew was this incredibly simple dish that you would make with butter, salt, and a bit of flour for thickening, but it was just that. Simple. Delicious? Good? Palatable? None of those things. The entire idea of this was that it was cheap, healthy, and took no effort or ingredients to make, which meant that it was something that was most popular in rough times. We talk a lot about the resilience of American people through the Depression, but we don't talk enough about how glad they were to leave meals like this behind once their situations improved. Nobody liked the thought of cabbage and milk stew after a long, hard day working and laboring or taking care of the kids and managing the house. The textures were really bad. Boiling cabbage meant that it would release a really pungent aroma. The texture of this was soggy, the taste was sour and bland, and there were just better ways of being healthy if that was your thing, especially with the advent of canning things. The mock duck was a substitute dish for duck meat, also made in times like the Great Depression, mostly because duck meat had become such a luxury. There was a type of gluten made out of wheat known as seitan, and you would roll that and stuff it to make this. Conceptually, I think people were trying to mimic duck breasts. You would pan-fry these just like them too, or roast them and serve with any kind of gravy. Now, this doesn't really sound that bad, right? Relatively normal compared to the rest of the nightmares we've been going through. Wrong? It was made of organic meat, or strictly vegetarian ingredients, both of which were really bad at capturing the texture or flavor of duck, or just coming anywhere close to it, really. The only momentum this dish had going for it was that veganism was on the rise thanks to health concerns, overfishing hazards, and environmental damages. People were significantly more excited about real duck meat when it did eventually become affordable and accessible, and most mock food is now left behind in the past. Let's be honest, it was smart, but that doesn't mean it was good. Honestly, I think oyster and prune stew is one of the least offensive ones here. It's an unusual combination, that's for sure, but that doesn't make it as much of a menace to society and culture as liver and banana casserole. This had briny, salty oysters mixed in with really sweet and stewed prunes. I can imagine what the idea was and what kind of vibe they were going for, but I think the execution failed the dish. The dish was really trying to take after some European-influenced cuisine, as you can probably tell by the fact that the broth was made with cream, butter, and usually French wine. Oysters were really cheap back in the 1800s and even in the early 20th century, and they were a staple meal for coastal communities like we talked about. Prunes were also something people genuinely loved and paired with meats often enough. European cuisine was slowly taking over American kitchens as more and more people wanted to experiment and try it out for themselves. The pieces were all set. You just had to put it in motion, but once people did, They realized this wasn't actually that good of a combination. It clashed too much with the sweetness of the prunes instead of contrasting it. Plus, overfishing meant oysters were generally being consumed less thanks to pressure from governments and environmental groups. Prunes had a fine reputation, but they were a side to steaks and stuff. Again, we have an aspic dish, and by this point, you might be able to piece together that people really went overboard with them. By that I mean too much experimentation is also a bad thing. Beef tongue in aspic is one of the biggest examples of that. It was a really classic European-style dish, and it had boiled beef tongue, which was still something people were a lot more open towards given the times. The issue started when people began to encase it in aspic, and the gelatin was also made from bone broth. It would be flavored with vinegar or wine and herbs, and the dish would typically be served cold. Now, I just want you to imagine that for a second. You're eating beef tongue, which is hard, chewy, and just foreign to you texture-wise, boiled, cold, and encased in jelly with distracting herbs thrown in. Can you actually believe this used to be something people had at formal dinners? I mean, I get throwing meat in a spick because it lasted longer and refrigerators weren't a thing, but this has to be some kind of food sadism. Hog maw was even worse. This was entirely the stomach lining of a pig. That's about as disgusting as it gets, but it gets worse when you get to the rest of the recipe. You would create this mixture of sausage, potatoes, onions, and spices, and then you would stuff the stomach lining with that. This wasn't the last step, since you had to boil it too. Now, some people baked it, but boiling it typically was the way to go because the stomach lining needed to be tenderized. This was something you would see a lot in Pennsylvania Dutch communities and Southern cooking. Some regional differences were things like whether or not the entire stomach would be served or whether it would just be used as a casing. Nose-to-tail eating had become extremely popular in the early parts of the 20th century because the mentality of not wasting a single bit of the animal was what kids had grown up on. Combine that with the fact that you'd be helping Dad out by taking one for the team and eating this with a smile, and you had both a logical and an emotional reason to force yourself through this. Even that couldn't save hog maw for too long because the preparation for it was just as much of a headache as eating it was, which really just made people question what they were even doing with this recipe anymore. Frog leg fricassee was this stewed dish that would involve frog legs that had really just been browned lightly in butter. They were simmered in a really creamy sauce too, with wine, onions, garlic, and herbs. Doesn't sound bad, right? I'm sure a sizable amount of us have gone fishing for frogs, maybe even eaten a few in our lifetimes. At least our older viewers might be able to relate. The idea was basically that you would sauté meat and stew it in this white sauce, and then you would use seasonings as per your taste. Most people kept it aromatic and herbal, but there were people who tried different spice rubs as well, typically in the South and Midwest. Wild frogs also used to be abundant in rural America in general, and a lot of people just thought they were a really convenient source of protein. Frog legs were still something that French and Cajun communities ate occasionally, but many people thought it was very off-putting. Besides, amphibians are usually seen as weird. It's not the kind of meat people are used to eating. They're not even farmed that much in the United States. It's not seen as exotic, quirky, trendy, or experimental. It's just odd and strange to people, which is a big part of why frog legs fell off. You have no idea the damage bad social perception can deal to a recipe's lifespan. Tripe and onion casserole was this slow-cooked dish that people made with beef tripe, which was the stomach lining of a cow. I know we've had some really bad casseroles on the list so far, and I genuinely am sorry for exposing you to the evils of our nation. Tripe and onion casserole was really just this slow-cooked dish that incorporated beef tripe with a vegetable butter-based broth. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what tripe is, it's the stomach lining of a cow. As you can probably guess, most of the items on the list are organ meat recipes, and they fell off badly. I've never seen something have a downfall like this. Tripe was readily available, it was practical and inexpensive, and it was also tender. This was one of the few things on the list that didn't have an immediately offensive texture, so there is always that. It still couldn't last in the long run though, because tripe simply had too much of an aroma that I can only best describe as the scent you would associate with a barnyard. On top of that, The gelatinous texture wasn't something people were down for, and most people would instead just go for normal or better cuts of meat and ration those out according to their budget, rather than bother with recipes like this that just made them feel bad after eating. Tomato surprises were hollowed-out tomatoes that had been stuffed with fillings you probably won't be able to guess, even if I pay you to. Hollowing out different kinds of vegetables, fruits, and peppers was a common and beloved culinary trend in America. But this was just taking things way too far. You know how some people just live for watching the world burn? I think whoever first came up with this recipe was the textbook definition of that personality type. For the atrocious fillings, you had tuna salad, shrimp salad, deviled ham, and eggs, and for the sweet ones, you had jellied fruit, cottage cheese, and whether or not you can believe it, marshmallows. It was actually considered a cocktail party snack at one point, and the entire idea behind naming it tomato surprises is that you really won't be able to tell what's in the damn thing. You'd be better off if you could, since then you'd know not to ever pick these up. Some foods should come with a warning, you know? Like, I get having creative party food, but you shouldn't sell your soul out just for that. Veal kidney pie was this savory meat pie that had been filled with sliced veal kidneys. And that's every bit as metallic as you're imagining. The fact that people would try to salvage it with onions, mushrooms, a rich brown gravy, and different kinds of herbs was really just a band-aid fix. Kidneys themselves are an organ meat that have an incredibly intense flavor, much like the liver does. You mix that in with more veal meat and savory ingredients, and you're honestly just going overboard. People didn't really realize that and thought that more might be better. Well, sometimes, less is more, and this is one of those times. Veal kidney pie really wasn't anyone's cup of tea. I mean, it was popular in some Southern and African American communities, but even then, that was like farmsteaders and people who had grown up on nose-to-tail cooking. Most of the general population aside from that was very much not accustomed to such overwhelming flavors and thought that this was too gamey for their preferences, and as a result, it ended up being left behind. Poached carp in milk was a dish that incorporated freshwater carp, which can be a really wonderful thing to work with. That is, if you know what you're doing, which the inventor of this dish clearly didn't. You gently simmer the carp in milk, and sometimes you throw in onions, bay leaves, nutmeg, or parsley, but the method was essentially just for softening the strong taste of the fish. Carps just look gentle. When you get to eat them, they can be just as overwhelming as any kidney pie or liver-based dish. It was really common to see this in Scandinavian and Eastern European cooking, but those were much different times. Carp used to be something people also relied on when they wanted to do nutritious cooking, but slowly, the poor fish would find that the cards were stacked up against it. Carp is a muddy-tasting fish, and it doesn't have a lot of goodwill with people. It's seen as unappetizing and bony, and there also just aren't that many chefs who specialize in making the most out of carp. Plus, as developments in fishing kept increasing, there were more easier and delicious options like blue crabs, for example. Nobody ever complained about blue crabs. Also, no one liked their fish poached in milk. Who thought of that? Seriously? Boiled eel with parsley sauce was this traditional British dish that should have just stayed there honestly. While I'm all for cultural appreciation, sometimes they just don't have good ideas. Why would you want to skin and chop freshwater eel and then boil it? And then there's the sauces. A sauce is supposed to help make a good thing better. It can't make a bad thing good, even if you make it as flexible as possible. And most flexible sauces are bare bones with some citrus elements. You just don't manage to make the dish click. Eels had some practical reasons for being eaten, which was largely just the fact that they were extremely abundant in North American rivers, but eel was also really affordable in markets if you were not near a river. It had a lot of fat and enough protein for people to consider putting it in their diets. The free aspect was the biggest draw for the crowd, really. Unfortunately, that's always an advantage that people end up abusing maliciously because overfishing concerns were a big part of why this dish fell off. That and eels were both weird to eat and unappealing to look at. Eels were slimy, they looked like snakes, and they were not that appealing to most people who had grown up on meatloafs and sandwiches. There was also a distaste for boiled or steamed fish, which probably stemmed from the fact that people spammed that technique as much as they could during the Depression. Pickled pig's feet were a really common dish in the southern, Midwestern, and Appalachian areas, and they were even beloved by immigrant communities like the Pennsylvania Dutch. So why is this here? Despite the way that eating the entire pig was normalized in those regions and how cheap pigs' feet were, people soon began to get really tired of them. America as a whole started becoming a lot more curious about what lies outside of the typical practical cuisine they've cultivated. The cornbreads, the pig's feet, the chitlins, what else is out there? That's a big part of why offal and nose-to-tail eating started declining. There were also health concerns with pickled pig's feet. They're really high in fat and sodium, and as we got closer and closer to the 21st century, that became too much of a no-no for most people. It's still Southern soul food, and some people make it out of tradition anyway, but it's largely just fallen into irrelevancy. Steamed cabbage rolls in buttermilk sauce were supposed to be a fun little variation of stuffed cabbage rolls, except they faced so much backlash. This was something that was a mixture of Scandinavian, Eastern European, and Mediterranean cuisines. America was really starting to take on its reputation of being a cultural melting pot by the middle of the 20th century, so there were a lot of different and new experimental dishes that were being tried out for the first time. The rolls were just boiled cabbage leaves that had been stuffed with a lot of ground meat, some rice, and spice rubs. They would be steamed and then served with a creamy buttermilk sauce. And this sounds pretty good so far, right? It's literally just a green wrap. Unfortunately, the buttermilk sauce part is what ruined it. People thought that it did not suit the recipe at all, and it actually distracted you from the cabbage roll way too much. Plus, it also made the cabbage soggy, diluted the flavor, and just did not mix well with the rice inside, which would also get really soggy from the sauce. This is a lesson, folks. It's not enough if your dish just tastes good. It needs to feel good too. Salmon mold with mayonnaise glaze faced some of the same trials and tribulations that steamed cabbage rolls did. Namely, the side they were served with ruined them. For the rolls, it was the buttermilk sauce, and for this, it's the mayonnaise glaze. There are lots of different glazes to throw on a jellied dish, and you need to be really thoughtful about what kind of glaze you use because depending on the kind of jelly and protein you're working with, it could go sideways really fast. That's doubly true if you're working with something like salmon. Jell-O and Knox gelatine were something people were okay with when they were at parties or their home, but they got sick of every new trendy food being another mold-based dish. People decided that if they were going to have a sustainable relationship with Jell-O, they would need to let go of all the savory stuff that didn't work. The 1930s to 1950s was also a period where people did nothing but use mayonnaise in whatever they could, and it honestly just didn't work. People began to be burned out from it, and they started to hate this dish, which was a mix of both things they were done with, Jell-O and mayo. Since this is our last round of items before we wrap the video up, I thought I'd save some of the most horrific ones for it. Creamed brains on toast is the top contender. This is exactly what you think it is, too. It's lamb, calf, or pig brains in a sauce that does it no favors or adds any flavor. I mean, really, stomach linings, feet, ears, brains, what was up with that? I get that there really has to be some advantage, situational or nutritional, that makes all these recipes worth it. But for the life of me, I just don't see it. Brains are a really inexpensive source of protein, which is something I can get. There was also the fact that before industrial meat processing, most butcher shops would sell whole animals. So it became common for Sunday suppers to make the most of that, especially because Sunday suppers were an event that people would usually bring a very empty stomach for. Unfortunately, this dish saw very little time at any table on Sunday, because besides all the reasons we've gone over on why offal isn't something people vibed with, there was also mass hysteria about mad cow disease spreading thanks to eating brains. Potted meatloaf was a preserved meat spread that was prepared by slow-cooking ground meats, like beef or pork with a lot of fat and seasonings. Then you would just pack it all into a jar or a crock and seal it with a nice little layer of fat. Think of it like a transportable plate. It was something people would typically use as a spread for bread or a dip for crackers. This was also one of the most common preservation methods before the advent of modern refrigeration, Even when refrigeration eventually did come around, it took quite a while before it became a household concept everywhere. Potted meat, on the other hand, was a technique people had been working with for centuries and were all too familiar with. When those things did come around, though, people were really quick to abandon tradition. I mean, it was also because most advancements were copying the concept of potting your meat to begin with. That's what Spam essentially was. Homemade potting disappeared, though, and most American homes stopped making potted meatloaves as a result. It wasn't a tasty thing, although it wasn't exactly very good. It just became redundant. Sheep's head broth was this really rich soup that was made by boiling the entire head of a sheep, and it had a lot of root vegetables, herbs, and even grains with it. Really, just a free-for-all. Throw whatever in the pot, hope for the best, see what works, and try your best to keep experimenting. Do you know that after they were done cooking the head, they would pick the cooked meat off of the skull and then put that in the broth? Besides the thing just tasting super awful, that is an incredibly labor-intensive process. Mind you, this was also before the rise of slow cookers, so whoever was making it would have to stand by hours watching the thing boil and making sure it didn't go wrong, wait for it to cool down, then spend quite a lot of time and go through probably a few hand cramps picking apart the meat. It was unappealing. The sight of boiled teeth, eyes, and brains was ghastly to a lot of people. And there just wasn't a lot of room for dishes of this variety, as tastes kept developing more and more towards what we have today in modern times. Boiled hog jowls with greens was this Appalachian and Southern dish that was always eaten on New Year's Day for good luck. What I don't get is why you would eat something bad to start your new year with. Hog jowls were a part of the animal we haven't really discussed so far, which seems like a big statement because short of their hair, I think we've covered every possible body part of a pig. Besides, of course, the cheeks, which is what these were. They had to be boiled until they were tender enough, and then they were typically served with mustard greens and cornbread. Still not as bad as some of the others, but that doesn't mean it would work today at all. It fell off because people stopped liking overly fatty cuts of meat, which is exactly what hog jowls were. There was too much fat in them. People also became fans of how pre-made food was making old familiar classics really easily available. As an American, it was probably never easier in history to eat ham or bacon than it was right after canning became a thing. Plus, fans of Southern cuisine were realizing that despite their attachment to the way things have always been done in the kitchen, a lot of the recipes they were used to weren't going to keep up with modern times. They left behind things like jowls in favor of things like pork belly roasts. Stuffed cow udder is by far the worst thing on this list to me. Maybe you might not agree, but I have a feeling you will. This was yet again another European delicacy I wish we had left behind in that country, or at least not enabled in ours. It was made by boiling the udder of a cow until it was tender enough to bite and chew through. Then you would cut it open, stuffing it with a mixture of different kinds of things like herbs, eggs, breadcrumbs, and ground meat. You could either braise it or roast it, and it was also something that people considered a delicacy for rich people. The udder was actually one of the most protein-rich cuts you could come up with. It was very fatty, it was a regional specialty in places with high amounts of European populations, and it had a unique texture. People described it as being similar to sweetbreads. Unfortunately, besides the general distaste for eating every bit of an animal, the health concerns around America being a bit too addicted to fat, and the general lack of fans for this dish, it was also extremely hard to prepare. It wasn't something that needed a lot of skill, but it did need a lot of time and hard work. You had to soak the udder completely, clean it of all milk residue and other pollutants, and then boil it before it was just ready to cook. As work culture started to become more and more fast-paced, this slowly meant that people were not able to keep up with dishes like this. Simply, it was just way too much work for not even a fraction of the same reward, and that's kind of a bummer. When you work with a dish like this, you try to make it appeal to people as much as you can, because it's already starting off on thin ice. But I guess somebody didn't get that memo. Before I get into why it died down, first, I need to talk about what a hamburger helper even is. This was a packaged convenience food product that General Mills came up with in 1971, and it was a big part of their whole Betty Crocker shtick. The idea was to make something out of a pound of ground beef, and despite the name, there's no hamburger ingredients besides the beef. You had a box with dried pasta, rice, and a seasoning mix. It actually became a big thing in the 70s because it became a symbol of processed food and was one of the most popular packaged products in the nation. On the other hand, it is definitely something I would say is entirely nostalgia-driven now. Hamburger helpers are still available, and they're a convenient meal to go for. Don't get me wrong, but the days of its trends are dead in the water and in the past now. People would go out in droves to get a fix of a hamburger helper back in the 70s, and this was a very much socially expected thing to do, by the way. Like, you know how your friends call you for a round of Chipotle and gossip? That was pretty much the idea back then, too. The things that did this bad boy in are movements like the health-conscious trends that were constantly spreading over America. Lots of people were in favor of healthier, smaller, and leaner meals made using canned food, and their argument was that the national rise of fast food, fusion food, and street food was really just doing a number on everyone's guts. On the other hand, convenience culture really has outpaced dishes like these in longevity, at least. For reasons like these, it's hard to find a good hamburger helper, and even harder still to find someone who still swears by them. Yes, stuffed pigeons with chestnuts were something that people actually did regularly reserve for their tables for Sunday roasts. And yes, this is definitely gluttony. Not bordering on the edge, not a stone's throw away, just pure, unadulterated gluttony. Stuffed pigeons were a traditional dish that were brought onto American kitchens primarily through immigrant communities. By this I mean, you can once again curse the British for their food. I really don't get what goes on in the kitchens in that country. It feels like every step they take is like playing Russian roulette because will they take a step forward? Will they set us back a decade or two? You may never know. Anyway, the chestnut thing was actually something that was brought into the equation thanks to the French. Apparently, chestnuts are a pretty popular stuffing in the region there. It makes sense that we tried things like this since in the middle half of the 20th century, all we ever did was delve as deep as possible into European cooking. Thing is, this dish was only possible because people regularly kept pigeons and raised them on their farms and in their living spaces. Thanks to the mass amount of urbanization, your typical two-bed in New York just doesn't come equipped with pigeon-raising facilities these days. Speaking of comfort food that doesn't ever really get old, let's talk about Big Mama's egg pie. Funny name, right? A lot of people think the title came from the rural South. There, the mom of the family was often always in charge of deciding how the family would eat, a lot more so than other communities. They became known affectionately as Big Mamas, and it was a pretty cute honorific for Southern black families. That's how they'd refer to the grandma or the eldest woman in the family who would cook all the delicious things you guys grew up on, like this pie here. When the Great Migration happened and those communities first flocked to America, they brought over a slew of family-friendly recipes with them, this egg custard pie being one of them. I didn't really get it either until I found out the history behind egg pie and how it's a staple of Southern homes. Basically, if you live up there, you've been around the block with this pie a few times. The custard eggs really need to be whisked properly to get it right though, but that's something grandmas, or as this dish would refer to them, Big Mamas were pretty well acquainted with. The best thing about custard pies was probably how easy it was to make them, which is also how they ended up getting so popular in the first palace. The ingredients were something you'd find around anywhere, really. You don't get a gray hair cooking food for a family on a yearly basis and come out of it with no tricks with basic things. Pineapple and cheese casserole might sound like an identity crisis, but I promise it works. A combination of sweet pineapple chunks, shredded cheese, buttery crackers, and a hint of sugar made for an unexpectedly addictive flavor combo. It's like your grandma's kitchen all of a sudden decided to have a party without you. Sunday suppers often featured this southern favorite alongside baked ham. The casserole's sweet and tangy notes paired well with the saltiness of the ham, and it was a hit at family gatherings and potlucks alike. It was one of those, is it a side or a dessert dishes that people would come back for seconds on. The origins of this quirky casserole are murky, but that's the Southern way of taking oddities and turning them into culinary gold. Cheese and pineapple? Sounds weird, tastes amazing. But add a crispy cracker topping and you've got a dish that is part comfort food and part conversation starter. Pineapple and cheese casserole may have fallen from the mainstream menu, but it's time to bring it back. Bring it to a potluck and serve it at your next holiday meal, but be prepared to explain why this unlikely pairing works so well. Spoiler, it's magic. Grits with cheese were one of the staples of Southern eating and culture for the longest time before Americans moved on from cornmeal. Hey, I get it. I'd probably tire of it if it was one of the only things I grew up on. People were just used to eating corn in all of its forms, and cornmeal was one of the most popular and normalized ones. As a result, cornmeal grits were common in most homes. Breakfast, lunch, or dinner, it really didn't matter. People could honestly just walk into a diner and expect them to serve grits. You didn't even have to take a look at the menu, since any roadside place worth its property value in salt would be serving one. Hell, they were easy enough to make at home. The cheese addition also made it a lot more palatable and made more Americans willing to try it. As far as Southern staples go, this one gets some use still, but only by old heads who remember the days of when you would have this for comfort food instead of a Big Mac and extra large fries. One of the soups that took off during the 1970s was stuffed cabbage soup. Remember how I said people really became besties with cabbage overall? Yeah, that meant that they were exploring its potential in every avenue of food known to the average American Joe. You had cabbage casseroles, cabbage stir-fries, cabbage stews, and now stuffed cabbage soup. I mean, on the one hand, it was boring as anything could be, and it really needed a lot of aromatics and seasonings to become something you could justify spending time on. On the other hand, it was dirty cheap, like unfairly cheap. And for some people, it was just free. That's right. If you had your own farmland with a crop-growing culture in your family, then you were likely raised growing cabbage, or at least having it in the home a lot. In rural areas, low-income ones and urban ones, for different reasons, whether it was the economics of it at all or the fact that modern American consumerism as they knew it was slowly heading to massive health problems for all participants, people flew like moths to cabbage soup. Spiced honey-glazed ham was a special one. It was one of the first few instances we had of spicy glazes or glazes in general being used in popular mainstream American traditions. Something breaking into the platform of Sunday roasts, potlucks, casserole Mondays, and church potlucks was always a big thing. It was basically the 20th century equivalent of someone getting a contract with the NBA right out of high school or landing a Tarantino production. It was your big break, your way to get your name out there in the industry. Dishes like these were some of the first things in the world that ever popularized honey glazes, which were really just a European concept for the most part until they became as big as they are now in America. Also, people just got tired of having the same old ham they were always used to. You need to switch things up, man. Keep it interesting. Take yourself out to a dinner you really like, and ham just isn't it. I mean, for breakfast, comfort food days, and intense cravings, I'm right there with you, but there's no sense in sticking to tradition so much you ignore the good ideas out there, right? Would you say you're the type to experiment? And if so, are glazes something you'd play around with? Okay, I know you're getting just a little bit tired of hearing about the South, but it's not my fault that so many of America's best hits in the 20th century, like Southern sweet tea, are from there. Sure, they might be mostly forgotten now, but if you go just a little back into their heyday, you'll find one of the tea from the most well-detailed and in-depth cups of tea you'll ever have. While the only ones you'd find these days having a genuine cup of green tea are suburban wives who have the time to spend fine-tuning every part of their health, or men who think herbal green teas excuse pounds of bacon and beers over the weekend, Southern sweet tea became a classic for a good reason. That reason was the Prohibition, when alcohol in general was banned for 13 straight years. Back then, people didn't have non-alcoholic beverages like they do today. Sure, there was root beer, but who really cares about that besides 16-year-olds? And don't even get me started on how awful non-alcoholic wine used to be. There was one savior that was slowly making its way into the social zeitgeist of American cooking, though. That was black tea. Because while Americans usually had green tea right from China, after the war, America and China weren't so friendly. As a result, they didn't share much either. They then started importing black tea from Sri Lanka and India, which was popularized as sweet tea in the South due to the insane amount of sugar and sometimes corn syrup they would add to this. It would be added hot, then served over ice, so it was really a great alternative to alcohol. It had everything you wanted in tea, and it worked really well if you added lemon into it too. Let's start with a dish that might sound like a dare: beef tongue stew. I can tell you before you wrinkle your nose, this was the kind of meal that made families sit up and ask for seconds. Beef tongue simmers low and slow with onions, carrots, and potatoes, becoming tender slices of savory goodness. Pot roast with a little extra, wow, really? On the side, basically. The beef tongue was a budget-friendly protein back in the day and didn't skimp on flavor. When you were trying to stretch a meal without sacrificing heartiness, it was a kitchen MVP for Sunday suppers. The trick was boiling the tongue until tender, peeling off the outer skin, not as gross as it sounds, I promise, and letting the tongue soak up the rich, brothy stew. When people started preferring prepackaged convenience over kitchen craftiness, this dish fell off the map. Beef tongue stew is a culinary throwback, but if you can find a tongue at your butcher or muster the courage to try one, then it's worth exploring. It's earthy, tender, and the sort of meal that makes you feel tied to a simpler, thriftier time. Who knows? It could become your next Sunday's favorite. Another thing that was really exclusive to the 1970s was the country's rediscovered love for casseroles. Things like hot dog casseroles are just proof of this all around. But really, you had a casserole for just about every fruit, ingredient, and meat you had ever heard of. The deal with this one is that it was a cheap casserole and a super beginner-friendly one. Seriously, your nephew could make this if you gave him honest instructions and believed in him enough. I mean, what really is there to do? You just take the pasta and the hot dogs, layer them casserole style, and pop them in the oven. Bam, you're done. And now you have enough food to either share with the family twice over or enough to last you the entire day and then some. Casseroles were super easy to make, convenient, and usually affordable, but could be made with super fancy ingredients if you were feeling like pushing your wallet and could fit just about any taste palette in the entire country. That made them pretty damn hard to beat. Plus, the 70s was known for being a massive return-to-work culture and the grind lifestyle for a lot of Americans, so the need for big, easy, and simple dishes was major. Nowadays, there are a lot of convenient apps and services to do that for you, so there's no need to bother with things like casseroles every other day. Braised lamb shanks with mint sauce are also something that have a particularly long history in America, and this time, it's with an Irish spin. Now, before we talk about what inspired this, let's talk a bit about the shank in general. This fine cut of meat has always been underappreciated since it came from the lower leg of the animal and was a lot tougher. It was something the wealthy class looked down upon because it was a dish you had to work for. You know, kind of like crabs. The more tender and soft meat was, the easier it was to eat, the more it would be associated with wealth. Lamb was also something that was really common in the 20th century throughout places like New England, where a farming culture really thrived. This rustic dish was a big part of the nose-to-tail style of eating, where families would devour every part of an animal in the name of not wasting a single bit of it. Personally, I think that's pretty considerate and respectful. How do you feel about it, though? While you type it out, let me tell you a bit more about braised lamb shanks. They fell out of fashion because, in general, people just didn't appreciate the gamey taste of lamb too much as time went on, but they were considered a big Sunday roast staple for people who were born in homes with farming-oriented lifestyles. Here's a dish that's actually something that'll get you feeling all warm and fuzzy. After all, what else does a good chiffon cake do? And there's no better one than coconut chiffon cakes. These started becoming popular in the late 1920s, and the earliest reference I could find was of Harry Baker, who kept a secret recipe for 20 years before it finally became public in the 1940s. Before he decided to share his secrets with the wider world, most cakes were pretty heavy and required a lot of batter. That wasn't really to the liking of the upper class, especially when we talk about Hollywood stars who Henry was known to work for. They preferred foreign styles of making cakes, and especially in Europe, chiffon cakes were really popular. Henry got a solid grip on the dish because he prepared so many of them for their special events, and eventually, he developed a perfect recipe that even General Mills had their eye on. When they did get it, they started promoting it in their Betty Crocker recipes, which was a surefire way to bring the cake into the mainstream. That's some real commitment to the bit. But his recipe was sought after because even despite how chiffon cake is naturally a pretty light and airy cake, his was like a floating cloud with the best parts of coconut milk and extract. Also, the shredded coconut on top and the cream of tartar really gave it that finishing touch. Yes, you read that right. This sounds like a dare, but it was once a quirky staple in Depression-era kitchens. Simple, affordable ingredients, cabbage and peanut butter rolls, were combined in a way that's unexpected but also surprisingly delicious if you give it a chance. Here's how it worked. Blanched large cabbage leaves were then spread with creamy peanut butter. The leaves were rolled up tight like little cabbage burritos and baked to soften and meld the flavors. The result? Oddly satisfying and packed with protein, a savory sweet combo that was perfect for families scraping by. Peanut butter was filling and hearty, and cabbage was cheap and plentiful, so everyone could get through another long day. In fact, some recipes included a drizzle of molasses or honey for extra sweetness. When times were tough, creativity like this filled plates and bellies. It may not sound like a five-star dish. Today, these rolls might be a curiosity, but they are a testament to the ingenuity of past generations. You may not see cabbage and peanut butter rolls on any menus these days, but there's no reason they couldn't be an oddball appetizer at your next retro dinner party. It'll be a conversation starter at least, if nothing else. Vegetarian chili definitely had its heyday in the same time as those moments I was talking about. Listen, when I say movement, I don't mean a 3-day bandwagon full of peaceful sit-ins and protests like we have today. I mean, like nationally, parents everywhere were livid. They couldn't stand that their kids were actually preferring to stay inside with a McDonald's Happy Meal and the television screen, and lots of them became super proactive about their family's diet and eating habits because of the massive revamp in culture. I mean, in this same century, these people went from surviving off of foraging wild mushrooms to watching moving pictures on a screen, having a magic box that just cools all their food full-time, slow cookers, the internet, computers, and God knows what else. All this to say, it was a fast-paced era, and people reacted with what they knew worked: vegetables. If the Depression proved anything, it was that there was a massive problem with people's diets. It wasn't economical, and it definitely wasn't healthy, and the alternative wasn't as impossible to switch to as most people would have you believe. Circumstances like this saw the rise of vegetarian chili in vegan cookbooks, but unfortunately, it couldn't make the cut, especially in the South, where people just outright rejected it. You know, guys back in the day used to hunt feral pigs and make wild boar shoulder roasts out of them. Nowadays, they listen to Andrew Tate. You gotta start wondering where we went wrong with everything. No, but really, wild boar shoulder roasts were a thing. And not only were they a thing, they were a thing with a lot of historical and culinary reference. So basically, a super important thing. The dish was a heritage of regional cooking that blended the best and most practical parts of Southern and Native American influences. Wild boars aren't something that were native to America, and indigenous people were the ones who were the most proficient hunters. They were also the ones who did the most experimenting and found out that things like smoking and roasting work really well here. You might think, but if they aren't native, how come so many are there in the South? Well, that has to do with how boars were introduced by Spanish explorers in the 1500s. Basically, those boars had escaped into the southern side of the country, and that's why you see so many in the South. Wild boar became a sign of bounty and became associated with feasts, holidays, and eventually roasts. But we've really moved away from hunting as a country. Whether you call it Holly Dolly bars or 7 layers, everyone has a fond memory of the biscuits we will talk about now. Hello Dolly bars were one of the nicest treats made by graham cracker crumbs, chocolate chips, sweetened condensed milk, and some of the freshest butterscotch chips you can imagine. This is a pretty vintage recipe. It goes back all the way to the 1960s. They gained a lot of attention as a bake sale treat that kids would peddle for a modest price. It's kind of like a good mix between a biscuit and a yeast roll, but its real charm is in how soft it is. The rise on these biscuits thanks to the yeast and the baking powder is something you can't match with any other biscuit on the market. Onion pie doesn't sound like a headliner, but this savory masterpiece was a Sunday supper hero in its day. A humble but luxurious dish of caramelized onions, rich cream, and flaky crust came together in layers. This was the kind of meal you closed your eyes and savored every bite. This pie wasn't only delicious, it was practical. Onions were cheap, easy to store, and full of flavor, so they were a staple ingredient for frugal home cooks. Simple pantry staples were often enriched with eggs, cream, and a dash of nutmeg or cheese, making it feel like something special. Savory tarts were a common way to showcase vegetables, and onion pie's roots can be traced back to European cooking, especially in Germany and France. Immigrants brought the idea to America, and it became a comforting staple in farming communities where onions were plentiful. Onion pie has all but disappeared from today's dinner tables, but it's worth rediscovering. Serve it with a fresh green salad or alongside roasted meats for a Sunday supper that's as timeless as it is delicious. Trust me, this pie is not boring at all. It's a flavor bomb in disguise. Again, disrespecting an icon has never been my scene, but I just don't think peanut butter sandwiches are anyone's go-to breakfast anymore like they used to be in the 70s. Really, when was the last time you stopped and made yourself a genuine peanut butter sandwich you were looking forward to right before heading out for work or college or whatever it is? People would much rather prefer to either grab some takeout, get a cute little coffee these days, or just take their Stanley bottle with whatever electrolyte-boosting drink of the day they have. Don't get me wrong, kids and teens will still eat these up, and they make for some amazing late-night snacks. But I feel like overall, we've started to move on a bit from the days where peanut butter sandwiches were reigning supreme over all else, you know? But hey, if you feel differently, please make that known in the comments. Some traditions die super hard though. Braised oxtail roast and oxtail in general is something you probably never will be able to separate from the African American community here at any point in time. Hey, it's not like other people don't enjoy it, but if you want your oxtail done right, authentic and exploding with flavor, you best go to a black mom. You might be wondering where the roots of all this stem from. Well, besides just how oxtail was given to slaves because it wasn't as desirable of a cut of meat as others, African American cuisine often takes on a lot of influence from West African culinary traditions too. Lots of dishes like egusi stew, for example, also feature bone-in cuts of meat. Braised oxtail roasts, on the other hand, were a stew that was just really hard to beat. After emancipation, most African American communities started to rely on oxtail a lot, and braised oxtail roasts became a key part of Sunday roast culture for a lot of families. It's still probably the most prevalent thing on the list today, at least for now. Johnnycakes, johnnycakes, whatever ancient name you know them by, this is another example of Americans trying to keep the love of sausages alive by putting new spins on dishes. Sometimes they were new ones. Sometimes they were ones that already existed for a while. A lot of people were pretty familiar with johnnycakes already, but the sausage version was something that was made by the people of North America. They started off with the indigenous communities over there, and ground corn was a big part of their daily routine. They started using ground corn to make these flatbreads, which were the basic breakfasts in North America. Eventually, farmers started getting their hands on a bit more pork than before, and thus sausages were brought into the mix. It's really a great lunch or breakfast, doesn't bloat you, doesn't leave you running close to empty still, and feels great while tasting delicious. People kind of debate where the name came from though. There wasn't really a Johnny that made this dish popular, nor was there any kind of historic or iconic journey that it was popular with. I guess maybe you could call it an offshoot of Johnnican, which was a New England term that was used for cornmeal cakes and the like, but then again, it's not really the same. Either way, what we're concerned about is how it takes a sausage and makes it shine. It didn't start out this way, as in the North it was really just more corn than sausages. When it hit New England, it was a breakfast meal that would come with molasses or syrup. In the South, you'd instead have cornmeal pancakes, and over time, more and more breakfast items kept getting tacked onto the dish until we hit sausages. Spam casserole might not have been glamorous, but it was a Sunday night legend. Picture this: Cubes of Spam layered with creamy mushroom soup and crushed crackers baked until bubbly and golden. The meal was salty, savory, and the kind of meal that made everyone forget they were eating canned meat. Mid-century families found Spam to be the ultimate convenience food. It was introduced during World War II and quickly became a pantry staple, especially in the South. It was the perfect way to stretch it into a hearty meal that fed a crowd in a casserole. Canned green beans or a sprinkle of cheddar, and you had a dish that felt like a celebration. Spam casserole was so iconic because it was so simple. There were no fancy ingredients, no complicated steps, just a can opener, a casserole dish, and a little creativity. It also had that irresistible combination of crispy topping and creamy filling that made casseroles so popular. Spam may not be as cool as it once was, but this casserole is a sentimental nod to a simpler time when families conjured magic from pantry staples. Bring out your retro recipe cards and give it a go. Who knows? It might just win you over. Despite what I just described about the 70s with casserole, you gotta believe me when I say something like zucchini fritters was also at the forefront of the entire decade. That's the thing about the 70s. It's just got so much going on that you can't box it into any single trend or sentiment that was spreading like wildfire. I mean, sure, there was an immense crowd that deeply preferred casserole-style dishes, and they stuck to that belief hardcore, but there was also a big chunk of America that was tired of the high-calorie, high-prep lifestyle of making big dishes that would last you a while. They wanted to switch to greener food that would help keep them lean and food that would also work with the party culture that was getting so popular during the 70s. People wanted bite-sized snacks they could gobble up when they were tipsy at parties, not big banquet dinners they had to sit down for and really make space for. Lots of people were treating eating as an excuse to socialize and go out, instead of finding genuine new food or eating for sustenance like in the first half of the 20th century. Roasted capon with sage butter is a bit of a shocker. Basically, it's a castrated rooster that was raised purely for slaughter. This used to be a centerpiece dish for everything related to Sunday roast dinner, festivals, celebrations, and more. But slowly over time, this kind of stuff really went out of fashion. The rooster has to be castrated at a young age, and the reason they do this is because then they don't really produce testosterone anymore. As a result, the bird tends to grow larger, with a bigger fat content and more tender meat. Capons became a symbol of luxury exactly because of these qualities. They were seen as a superior bird with a lot of richness. There was also the fact that the overall taste just wasn't that gamey, which honestly made it fit so many people's palates. This entire practice of caponizing a rooster is something that first started in ancient Rome, and there are even agricultural texts that describe the process. From there, it found its way to Europe, and naturally, they eventually brought it over to us. You can expect a buttery flavor and a very, very crispy skin and tender inside, but thanks to industrial poultry farming and changing tastes, even these outstanding qualities couldn't keep it in the game forever. Your grandma's gingerbread pancakes were a very special type of spiced pancake that had flavors like ginger and cinnamon, plus molasses too. You could think of it as like a spicier pancake or gingerbread, though gingerbreads themselves have been around for ages, with popular meals like gingerbread houses being the pride and joy of both cooks and casserole across many countries, especially the USA. This fusion of both gingerbreads and pancakes happened as a result of fusion food culture in the 1930s to 1970s. People loved to mix and match pre-existing dishes to create wacky combos, and sometimes you got pizza burgers, which weren't really that much of a hit, and sometimes you got gingerbread pancakes. It was like Russian roulette, but with food, and despite how these only came around in the middle of the 1950s, they really held their own. It became something that families could enjoy on a budget because it really didn't take anything. But it was a recipe that was in its glory days during the start of the 19th century. That's why only grandmas and the like remembered it. It has all the sweetness of a regular pancake, but it has a slightly spicier aftertaste too, thanks to the cinnamon and ginger. Scrapple is the answer if you've ever wondered what happens to all the pork parts nobody wants to talk about. This zero-waste dish is the ultimate pork scraps, cornmeal, and spices combined into a savory loaf that's sliced and fried until crispy. Scrapple is Pennsylvania Dutch kitchen hailing. designed to stretch a small budget and a whole hog. It's got the texture of a crisp-edged pancake and the heartiness of sausage, making it great for breakfast or dinner. Hot, with a drizzle of maple syrup or a dollop of apple butter is best, though the purists say that ketchup is the only way. One of Scrapple's biggest charms is its versatility. You can eat it sweet, savory, or somewhere in between. Its name doesn't exactly roll off the tongue as gourmet, but Scrapple has a rustic appeal that has kept it alive in some corners of the country. For some, it's nostalgic. For others, mysterious. But it's definitely food with a story to tell. Scrapple, though it's not so much a thing these days, deserves a comeback, if only for its use of everything but the oink. It's a poor man's pâté or an ancestor of food sustainability, but it's proof that resourcefulness can be delicious. Now, aren't you thanking God that no one makes these dishes for supper anymore? Comment which dish was the weirdest to you and don't forget to like and subscribe.